and they put literary graffiti over maybe all walls in 20 rooms. It's an amazing thing to see.
It was spooky.
It's just, it's hard to explain until you see it.
It is.
I mean, it's quotes from people's books.
I thought when you told me that I would find maybe 10 or 12 quotes on the walls, but we're talking about maybe 40 or 50 quotes per room, and they're in the hallways, and they're all
Under
over.
things, over things,
Yeah, I mean, just a
mostly
stunning
in
amount of
longhand
material.
and printed.
Yes, all done with different colored magic markers. What we discovered is the literary crowd is not visual. There were far fewer little flowers or butterflies or
Diane
anything.
Wachowski had the only sketch, and she had the sketch,
Yeah.
little sketch of herself.
Yeah, and some illuminated letters on her name.
Yeah.
But famous people are quoted, and then people from rock bands are quoted. It was an eclectic set of quotes from different people.
So can we move to have it saved as a historical?
Bill keeps
It
trying.
would be interesting.
There's no way to do it.
There's no way to do it. It's on the walls. It would be incomprehensibly expensive. I would like just Jack Kerouac's quote.
Yeah. Who put that up there? Did you?
No, no.
Oh, it wasn't
No,
you?
I have no idea who did it. There's a quote from one of the on the road, and there's Hunter Thompson is my favorite.
Yeah.
I could get maybe a little chainsaw and just cut it out.
Buzz
of the
it
wall.
out.
Maybe what we could do is ask MSU to donate all of those, cut them out, and donate them to a local charity like Lansing
For an
Online
auction.
News.
Well, they
for an
could sell
auction.
them like bricks.
Yeah.
You see, that kind of thing. And that might be a good fundraiser for some worthy group. The challenge with the building is it was never constructed in a way that was going to survive the ages because it is wood with brick on the outside, and there's really no way. If you rehab it and add enough insulation and other modernities, some of those rooms would be 2 foot around. So, I mean,
Well, it was built as a combination dorm classroom. Well, it's still dorm classrooms.
Yeah.
So the dorm room is about this size. What is it, 10 by 15?
and they had
A lot
4
of them.
people in them. They
4
said.
people in them and a closet.
We did find out, though, the closets were very useful. Thomas McGuane had a particular use for those, right?
He
Phil?
did. That's what he told us when we did that event at Michigan State University with him, Jim Harrison, and Richard Ford. Somebody asked him, maybe it was me, asked him why he was with the Red Cedar Review, and he said they had the biggest closets. And at that, that was, okay, what's the punchline? The punchline was, at that time, there wasn't very many places to take young women on campus. Only McGuane would have said that.
But you've got quotes from
Richard Ford,
Ford and
Jim Harrison about
yeah.
spending time in there.
Yeah. So we're going to add to that. After it airs on the new Comcast show, Wednesday nights at 9, which I guess is channel 16 for Comcast viewers in the area, then we're going to take that and retread it and make it a YouTube and put it up on Lansing Online News and add some additional information. So it's really kind of an integrated public media extravaganza these days.
Of ephemera.
It is,
When you
yeah.
think of it. It's
yeah.
ephemera. It's going to be
gonna
gone.
In fact, they made you disappear in one part of the
Yeah, I
video.
know.
That was kind of fun.
Whoosh.
That's one of the fun things about being the editor. You get to do those kind of things. One thing that's not disappearing, but that's coming up Thursday night, is you have you did an article on a gentleman who's the historian for the Grand Hotel.
Right. Imagine a hotel that has a historian full time. That's pretty cool. Of course, he only has to work. He doesn't work winters. His name is Bob Kagitz, and he is going to be coming to the Greater Lansing Historical Society Thursday meeting at Capillary District Library at 7 p.m. And he's going to talk about the long history of the Grand Hotel. It's 126 years old this year, and amazingly interesting people that stayed there. 5 presidents. Mark Twain. Mark Twain lectured there in probably, I think it was 1897.
Wow.
He got paid $1 per ticket. Maybe there was 300 people.
That was big money.
Oh, it's huge money. And he was doing it because he was just broke.
Yeah.
He was on the lecture circuit because he was absolutely in poverty.
Yeah. I read the Swan biography of Mark Twain many years ago, and he
Sad.
was always broke.
It was sad, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, he read it. It was
Money
terrible.
worries drove him crazy.
Well, he
all
also
the
made
time.
a lot of bad investments
Well, there's that.
in technology.
Technology.
He wasn't the first, but I think it'll be interesting because most people go there and they don't realize the history of a building
Yeah.
and what it's been through.
We talked about how you need to set up QR codes so that you could walk up to a building, there'd be the QR code, you could use your smartphone, and then it would play a little thing on your smartphone to tell you the history of the building. Is that going to happen? Now, you were going to...
It will, yes.
Yeah?
The Historical Society is going to do downtown tours again this summer. They're going to do one a month.
Oh, really?
instead of just one during the summer. They're going to do one every. I think it's the first Sunday or first Saturday of every month. And then next year, probably going to add Rio Town and then Old Town. So people will get to learn, but the best way is to have something permanent. So
Right.
you can, and some of the most common buildings had real interesting uses over time. You know, whether
Oh, yeah.
they're brothels or
Yeah.
Not here.
yeah, there was. We learned that when
There was none of that here.
we learned there was last time. Somebody in the crowd told us about a brothel that we were talking about. Really, we didn't know that.
The disembodied voice you hear in the background is Todd Haywood of the American Independent News Network. We're going to be talking with Todd a bit later about some issues related to freedom of the press, Open Meetings Act, all of those exciting things. And it fits in with the discussion, really, with our first guest as well, who's Ann Woywoody of the local chapter of the Sierra Club of Michigan. And she's here to tell us about a special event coming up on Thursday night. It's called Less is More. And it's not just a Mies van der Rohe chair. I don't
Right. That's correct.
The less is more is relating to what's happening with food.
Right, it is, and thanks a lot for letting me be here to talk about this. Sierra Club and a large number of disparate organizations, ranging from farmers, the Michigan Farmers Union, the Food and Water Watch, which is a food and advocacy and
They're
consumer
great.
group. Yeah, they are. The Humane Society of the United States and a variety of other organizations have come together in an effort to try to level the playing field for sustainable agriculture and get federal subsidies out of supporting polluting factory farms.
Yes.
And we've focused specifically in Michigan. We've spent, as you folks may know, Sierra Club and a number of organizations have for many years been trying to get polluting factory farms under control. We've been pursuing all of the environmental efforts. We've used litigation, a full range of things. But we realized starting about a year ago that we weren't going to win this fight as long as our federal subsidies, federal farm subsidies, are going to support polluting CAFOs. And so this was an effort. After spending a fair amount of time doing research, we looked at where the funds were going, particularly in one Farm Bill subsidy called EQIP, and discovered that in the past 15 years, about $27 million has gone to about 36 polluting factory farms in Michigan. These are farms that have had violations that have with Environmental Protection Agency or the Michigan DEQ. They've been cited, they've been fined. 27 of them were fined for up to $1.3 million, I think it was. But they're getting money, and the folks who
Through
are
EQIP?
through EQIP,
Uh-huh.
and they
That's
are
the Environmental Quality and then
incentive program,
Yes.
right? And it's intended to help promote conservation. That was its original purpose. But what we discovered is a lot of the practices that are being funded are the things that actually contribute to pollution. Like if you have a sustainable livestock operation with grass-fed beef, for example, one of the folks we've worked with is a farmer, Maynard Fury. He raises grass-fed beef. He doesn't need to have a waste lagoon to store his waste in.
Right.
But you can get a couple $100,000 for a waste lagoon under EQIP if you are building a CAFO. In fact, you can get money to expand it under the current rules in Michigan. While you can't get money to expand your fenced-in grass-fed operation. So we've been looking at this for quite a while, and it's just sort of staggering when you begin to add it all up, how the money is going.
Sue Spagnola, who runs La Dolce Vita, the goat cheese operation up outside of St. John's, Michigan. I know she was very excited about the EQIP program, and then she began, I think, as she was applying it, I mean, you begin to realize it isn't really designed for that, though that's what it sounds like it's for.
Right, well, and it should be. And
Yep.
part of what we've done is figure out who's responsible for making the decisions. Good. And it's actually possible here in Michigan to get the decisions shifted. U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is a an office of USDA that oversees a lot of different kinds of programs, is responsible for setting the criteria for how funds are spent under equipment. And the state conservationist is in fact the person who makes that decision. So we've been focusing our efforts at that person. Gary Lee is his name, state conservationist here in East Lansing, and started off by meeting with him about a month ago to point out where the real absurdity of the system is now, and to ask him to shift the priorities and begin to take the funding out of funding polluting operations.
The USDA Farm Bill also requires that if the only real crop subsidies go to so-called commodity crops, and those are used to feed livestock. Those corn plants that you see in the fields in the summer are not niblets coming to your table.
Yeah.
They are, or cornflakes. They're fed to livestock, and it's corn, wheat, soybeans, some sorghum, some of the major commodity crops. If you decide to lop off 10 acres and decide to have a nice little fruit and vegetable operation, which might be a nice thing for some family members to run, you will lose all of your subsidies for your commodity crops under the USDA Farm Bill. And that's some of the kinds of disastrous policies that have been included in that bill over the years. I mean, there's so many things in that Farm Bill that are counterproductive to the kinds of society that we'd really like to have with sustainable food.
And I think if you look around today, people intentionally go to buy food at farmers markets so they can see the face of the person who's raising the food. People are involved in community-supported agriculture. We're seeking out organic foods and all that. So we are currently using our tax dollars, the ones that we send in to pay taxes, to subsidize operations that we don't support through tax subsidies, while the folks who we are trying to support are not getting any support whatsoever.
And we're talking billions.
Yes, we are. And so that's why we started here in Michigan with this effort, because there's a pretty long curve. I mean, farmers should be supported. And one of the things that we realize is a lot of the people who are involved in these kinds of industrial operations would not have chosen to go into that field. They end up there because that's where the subsidies are, that's where the agricultural industry points them, and it is so we feel like one of the things that can be happening is to encourage them to go back to more sustainable farming. And it is doable. It's not going to undercut our food system. It's, in fact, quite sensible.
But that's not where agriculture is headed. When the new USDA Agriculture Secretary, Tom Vilsack, came to Charlotte, Michigan, I did a video you can find on YouTube, where a farmer from southwest Michigan, which is loaded with the CAFO problem, he's a farmer who was just infuriated to find a huge swine operation go in next to him, and it's a German operation. It's not, the profits aren't being kept here in the United States, and it's run by people who really don't speak the language here. And he said that since that operation has moved in, using the right to farm law in ways I don't find palatable, it means that he and his wife and his kids have had nothing but constant respiratory illnesses. The stench from those operations, lagoons or not, is just intolerable. It has made his property unsaleable because no one in their right mind would go anywhere near that kind of polluting operation and what it might be doing to the groundwater and the rest of it. And he's really getting no relief. And what shocked me was that both State Senator Debbie Stabenow and Vilsack looked surprised.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like, what do you mean? You don't know that it's farmers who are becoming upset about what's happening with these trends?
Well, that's, and one of the people who works for Sierra Club, we've been delighted to work with for many years, is Lynn Henning, who is a farmer and lives down near Hudson, and has been fighting concentrated animal feeding operations for about a decade now. She and her neighbors have 12 of these factory farms in their immediate vicinity. So there are many things that have to be done to bring these under control, but we thought it was about time people understood that the funding that is supporting them is coming in large part from our own tax dollars. And that's something that people should be irate about and fighting back against. It's crazy when you go out of your way to support local farmers to realize that they're not getting the support and the dirty operations are.
This is LCC Radio 89.7 here in Lansing, WLNZ, and we're talking with Ann Woywoody of the Sierra Club about a meeting Thursday night on campus at MSU called Less is More, and I'm sure people can find out all more information on your website.
That's right.
And are there any other states that are doing something similar?
We've started this here, and there's a lot of interest in this around the country. It's one reason why there's such a big, diverse coalition that's come together behind this. But because we had been running into this for many years, and Lynn in particular, Lynn Henning, had done a lot of the research, what we realized was we had to pull it together and make the argument clear. And the other thing was to look for somebody locally who could make the decision. There's a lot going on in Washington trying to change the Farm Bill, and we're very supportive of those efforts too. But we wanted we were seeing constantly that people were getting funded to do things that were adding pollution, and that seemed crazy. And so we're starting here. We expect that other states are going to take it up.
Have you ever been at a CAFO? I have.
Yes.
Have you? Where?
Yes, I I was invited down to one near Hudson, the Brebehoff operation, with a group of journalists, and it was interesting. But I've also been downwind of them regularly and have gone on water testing efforts as well.
Was this when the farmers thought that they would educate journalists and they would be on their side? And
Yes.
I think maybe they were surprised at the reaction.
I think that there is, the more people find out about it, the more they understand this is not good.
I was in one about 35 years ago when they were first coming into the state. And I remember in my naive sort of old MacDonald approach to agriculture, walking into this swine facility and being absolutely bowled over and just horrified at the confinement of the animals in such small spaces, which of course has led to the overuse of antibiotics because it does two things. It causes faster growth and muscle growth, and it also is the only way that they can survive that kind of environment because of the pathogens available. And there was just a physician in England who has been reinforcing again what we all know, which is we're getting these antibiotic resistant types of bacteria for which we have no solutions anymore, and we are still continuing to overuse antibiotics in agriculture.
Right, and one of the people who will be on the panel on Thursday night, it's going to be at Wells Hall on campus, is with the Pew Charitable Trust on animal agriculture issues, and she focuses specifically on health issues. We also have Daniel Imhoff, who has written the book Food Fight about the Farm Bill fight, and also written an excellent overview, sort of hard to take when you sit down to read it, about CAFO's very large picture book that really lays out the issues very clearly.
And I'm assuming he's not Jim Imhoff's brother.
I don't think so.
The Imhoff family is
good question.
Yeah.
No.
Well, kind of building on that, actually, did you see today in the Washington Post that there's sort of this national movement to introduce laws in the state level to prohibit taking video or having undercover video or pictures taken in these large feeding operation situations?
Yes.
And
Kansas
what does
went
that
so
say?
far as to try to pass a law that said you could not take a picture of a farm field from the road,
Right.
from a public thoroughfare, because they don't want GMO crops identified.
Yeah,
If you
this
go out
is-
to the Cargill facility on Oakham's Road, it looks like it is that you're headed into a CIA operation with the signs warning you that you have no right to be here, you'd be trespassing. This is not, the farmers are getting paranoid about this too.
Well, and these efforts to try to control access, we've run into here in Michigan. They haven't tried to pass the law, but again, back to Lynn Henning, she actually had a personal protection lawsuit brought against her by a CAFO operator who claimed that she was taking photographs of his family. And what she was doing was documenting the pollution. And photographs are really important. We actually have been able to work very closely with Lighthawk, which is a fantastic volunteer Air Force volunteers who will take us up and allow us to take photographs at key times when pollution is particularly bad from these factory farms, because it is intermittent often. The waste will be spread for a while, it'll wash off, and then there's no way to show exactly where it came from. So, but we're concerned about the effort to try to prevent people from documenting the harm.
and then,
I jumped out on a whole road last year and was taking pictures as a tractor was going up and down the field. And the woman jumped out of the tractor, came running over, wanted to know what was I up to. And the more I thought about it, I thought, Isn't that interesting? There's an awful lot of dirt going up into the air, and I remember reading that we lose an inch of topsoil every year to erosion in the wind. Maybe I will take more video because I'm perfectly within my rights being here on a county road.
Sure,
That's a real issue.
it
If
is.
we don't have the picture, I mean, and when you go and you try to find pictures to use in any kind of documentary, it's very hard to get them.
And we have been working on this for the past 10 to 12 years. So we do have a lot of documentation using photographs, using videos, and it is one of the reasons, though, that we decided to go after the financial issues too, is that the enforcement is not happening the way that we had previously. And we've always had a tough challenge with this, but once there was a change in administration, the DEQ unfortunately has lost resources and has really been in less and less of a position to actually enforce the law.
And that actually bridges another sort of question and compare and contrast, and that is, we're subsidizing these huge agricultural operations, which are polluting, as you've documented and are documenting. What about big oil? I mean, aren't we doing the same thing there?
Oh, yeah.
And so, what is your sense of success here when we see the similar types of funding with taxpayer dollars and the outrage at the potential pollutions?
Right. The analogy is exactly right, and I think we have seen this over many, many decades, and it is the same thing. The entrenched lobbies that are able to get in and advocate for specific benefit to their companies, and the companies that benefit then get bigger, more effective at lobbying, and they keep it rolling. As we're trying to move Michigan and the country towards a cleaner future, less climate change, this is one of the big issues, because you'll hear people complain about the Solyndra solar
Sure.
subsidy, but it's nothing compared to what's going on in terms of oil and gas and coal subsidies that have been going on for many decades. And so there is a need to get money out of this whole range of activities, or to make sure that the playing field is even. A lot of the farmers are not actually interested in subsidies. The sustainable agriculture folks are not interested in subsidies. It's a pain to deal with the government, et cetera, but they don't want to have to compete unfairly, and that's basically what's happened with the subsidies across the board.
New Zealand got rid of farm subsidies and phased them out, and they said they'd be happy to come here and tell us how to do that kind
Great.
of thing. One of the constraints that's becoming increasingly obvious with the industrial ag system that we have now is we are literally farming with oil. And what we're doing is we're subsidizing the industries with tax dollars so food remains quote unquote cheap. But all the real costs of the food system are the externalities that we're facing in our healthcare system when we have overly processed foods, and that cereal that you buy at the supermarket, maybe 10% ever goes back for the commodity. The rest is for advertising, packaging, all of the science that goes into making it as sugary as possible and as addictive as possible. So we externalize all of these costs that society bears. We take tax dollars to put into these industries, and then we don't fund the regulators who would at least keep an eye on them. So it's sort of this perfect storm of disaster headed our way.
Yeah, absolutely. The system there are so many problems with the industrialized agriculture system. In many cases, the workers have just horrific conditions, and while they're not necessarily migrant workers, they're often brought into the country specifically to work in the conditions. You've talked about hog operations. Hog barns in industrial operations like these have to have fans running all the time, because the hogs stand over waste pits, and they literally would die, as with people in those hog operations, if they were not running fans all the time. So that's part of it: the water pollution, the air pollution, the impact on the quality of the food. And it's, as several folks who have looked at this from an economic standpoint say, it's basically depopulating the countryside.
Yes.
And it's not necessarily giving us any benefit from that, because what's happened is, with the subsidies and with the insistence that concentration is the way to go, we're actually creating this false sense that this is cheap food, and it's not. It's not cheap food. And the externalities are very clear there. I have a sister who's allergic to virtually anything with corn in it.
Yeah.
And my
yeah.
guess is that that has a lot to do with the prevalence of corn in everything. So whether it's Purell on her hands or anything that she encounters, that's
It's such a huge topic. I was reading today Jeremy Grantham. I would direct people to Business Insider. And it's an issue that I've been increasingly concerned about since I went to a workshop of the Great Lakes held last year. Phosphorus is a limiting factor in growing food, and we are busy running out of phosphorus. And one of the things that industrial farms do, as they were showing with the research last year, is a lot of it is contained in runoff that goes into our streams that does not get reclaimed. So we're taking a limited resource. I mean, we're talking about, you think peak oil was a concern. Peak phosphorus is a real limiting factor on the future of growing any food on the planet. And you're looking at a possibility of simply mining it out of existence here within the next few decades.
And it's ending up in the western end of Lake Erie, which
Yeah.
is suffering severe algae blooms and is on its way to dying again. And largely because of the Maumee River, which is coming in with a huge amount of agricultural input. Exactly. I mean, this is smart farming. You know, sustainable agriculture is about using the land appropriately and keeping all the good stuff there, not having it washed downstream, making sure that you're growing the food well, and also providing healthy conditions for the workers and the families that are living there. And we've instead invested in these factory farms that are exactly the opposite.
USDA did some research a couple years ago, which is only on a couple vegetable crops, and I think it was potatoes and carrots and so forth, and they found that in the last couple decades the nutritional value of those crops has dropped by 12%. And a lot of that has to do with the lack of nutrient uptake on the part of the plants because we no longer are treating soil as that living web that really sustains all of us. We're instead, in essence, burning it with anhydrous ammonia and other chemicals. I mean, that's just natural gas being pumped
Right.
into the soil. It's a disaster what we're doing, and the reality is we could go back to, I mean, there's a real opportunity to make all that open land in Lansing farming hub. We're going to have some people in to talk about that soon.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you think the Lake Erie situation is going to cause some national concern, or at least regional? I mean, it already is, of course. But
Yeah.
when I was a teenager in the Saginaw Bay, that got people moving when you couldn't swim in it, you couldn't
Right.
live near it,
Yeah.
and
I think
it
it's
started
gonna-
killing a portion of the economy.
Yeah, I think there was a New York Times article recently about the algae blooms in Lake Erie, so beginning to elevate it, and I think it could. I think that part of this is getting people to understand there is this connection, and they need to be responding to what's going on. And I think you're right that people do respond to it. Ironically, we fix some things and then create other problems. But as long as the intention is there and people are demanding it, I'm hopeful that we'll begin to see it turned around. The challenge with farm runoff of all sorts is that it is this sort of more dispersed kind of runoff. It's a lot harder. It's not end of the pipe. Right, but that's where knowing what's going on, and this is something that we're really pushing, understanding what's going on the ground is important. That's one reason why the photographs are important. It's important to have documentation, water quality testing going on, and training people to understand what they're seeing, that it's not just by chance that the water pollution is happening. It's actually designed in some cases of these facilities. They're designed to discharge wastes into our waterways. And I'm not sure that all of the folks who are operating these understand that, but they actually have pipes that run under the fields that run out into waterways, and it's a direct conduit of manure and other kinds of pollutants into the water.
This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We're talking with Ann Woywoody of the Sierra Club, and boy, it's I'm glad food has become a huge issue because it has been relegated in the past. I would try to get the attention of people in the straight press, and they would say, well, that's just a farm story. It's only of interest to farmers.
Yeah.
They said that to me, by the way, the first time I called up friends at the Free Press, the night I wrote the first story on PBB in Michigan, and said, you better get on this. And they said, that's just a farm story. And they said, don't you eat? It took them 2 years to figure out they ate.
Yeah.
So it's a real problem. We're becoming more
Yeah.
sophisticated, though.
Yes.
We're learning, and that's what Thursday night will do.
Yes.
Now,
Yeah.
will representatives from the other side be there? And then I guess second question, are you videoing it at all?
Yes, actually, we're going to do a web feed, a webcast of it. Not terribly sophisticated, but
I'll help.
we are providing. I've got my iPhone that's going to be used, and we will be trying to broadcast it simultaneously. We'll also try to capture it.
I'm gonna try.
Yeah, great. And so, but I do expect that people on the other side may well show up. We haven't seen a whole lot of response so far from the industrial ag interests, which is interesting because I think it's a hard one to respond to. What we've put out there is the factual information about what's going on should be of concern to everyone, and they normally we get lots of pushback, and that's not happening now. And I'm wondering if it's because they realize that they have a difficult story to tell when they want to say, let's subsidize polluting agriculture. So,
I'd like to say that I believe that they realize that, but I think they're probably just playing a really good PR game. Because we saw that with Enbridge down along the Kalamazoo River. We see it, they're doing it now. They're
Yes.
saying, oh, we can't get the oil that's still left on the bottom of the river. It's too much work. And the EPA is saying, no, get it.
right.
And now they're putting out. Did you all see the study they put out that tar sands oil evidently doesn't sink?
Ooh.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's what
That's
I missed
Enbridge is
that.
they're saying.
So,
Yeah, they put out a study that they funded that says that tar sands oil doesn't sink. So I think you're
Cannot
gonna,
be on the bottom.
so it's not possible.
Right.
And
Wow.
there's all kinds of questions about that. They didn't even use the Cold Lake crude that we had in Kalamazoo. So I mean, there's all kinds of
Yeah.
questions there. But I do wonder what kind of sort of scientific misconduct are they engaging in right now in preparation for what you're doing?
Well, and we've had those fights for quite a while. When I started working on this issue, first I should say in the 1980s, Michigan on the factory farms was actually in the front. We had litigation brought under our AIR Act by then Attorney General Frank Kelly, and they literally drove out the CAFOs here. And I used to have people in Missouri and Mississippi and North Carolina who were suddenly seeing these pop-ups say, gee, you're lucky. Well, it turns out in the 1990s, the law was entirely undone, and Michigan had by far the worst law by about 2002. And we began to reverse it some by getting the EPA involved and getting a change of administration. And the DEQ director under Governor Granholm actually got it, Steve Chester, and did his best to begin to bring it under control. But the ag industry continued to push very hard. So they started off saying farms don't pollute, period. And in fact, they should be exempted from any pollution laws. And that was what we fought for the first several years. And we actually went back to that some starting in 2011 when the two first laws signed into law by Governor Snyder rolled back some of the protections that had been in place under a voluntary system. They basically said if you're complying with the voluntary set of guidelines, then you're considered in compliance with provisions of the Clean Water Act. It's not all of them, but many of them. And we've been challenging that for quite a while. So it is about sort of this pseudo-scientific sense that, well, everybody's well-meaning, and therefore they're really not trying to pollute, therefore there is no pollution. And it's crazy, and it's counterproductive, too, because I don't think it helps anybody to just delay coming to terms with what's actually happening. It's not good for anybody who eats, and it's not good for anybody who's downstream. All of those things are serious concerns.
So what's one of the factory farms an equivalent to a septic tank? Home septic tanks. I mean,
Yeah.
which you can't dump them into a
Right.
river or a stream or.
Right.
I mean,
But it's actually more equivalent to a wastewater treatment facility.
Right. The
They-
amounts are staggering.
yeah, I mean, it's going to be like a city.
Yeah, if you there's a point at which permits are now required, water quality permits are now required, and that's the equivalent in human waste production of 16,000 people. That's the point at which the permit is required. Below that, there's not one required unless the facility's been caught polluting, and then there's a decision by the environmental agencies to begin to control it. So yeah, it's not a septic system.
No.
Not even close.
Those,
No, but I meant it
Yeah.
gives me an idea. It'd be like
Right.
16,000 separate septic
Yeah.
systems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I keep wanting to beat my head against a wall when I realize that the right to farm law has not been perceived as allowing somebody to have a couple of chickens in their backyard in the city,
Yeah.
or to put a nice little veggie garden in the front lawn, right? Because
Which
you
all
can't do
those-
most
you can't
places,
do
yeah.
most places.
Right.
Including here in
No,
Lansing.
but
Right.
right to farm somehow, which means that you can open up one of these CAFOs downstream and downwind of me if I'm not careful, and
Yeah.
that's a disaster.
And unfortunately, I think the fundamental concept behind right to farm was not bad, but what happened was it has been perverted to mean not somebody pursuing the normal kinds of practices of farming. I mean, if I grew up in an agricultural community where there were more cows than people, and as folks built houses next to one of the largest dairy farmers, and when he was out spreading manure in the spring because that's what you do, they objected, and it's like, no, he has a right to do that, but that's not the same as then turning into an industrial operation
Very
and
different.
basically getting exemptions. And that's what we saw happen in the 1990s, that shift in what the law actually said and allowed. And the burden put on farmers and other rural people in particular has been just huge.
The industrialization of agriculture has been staggering. I mean, I think when I saw the response to the Super Bowl ad about how everybody loves the farmer, right? And they
Right.
used and it was so all those iconic images, the guy out with one beef cow, beef cattle out there, and it's like, no, that's not exactly what we're talking about nowadays.
Exactly.
People really need to go back to, I always say that at least grow a little bit of your own food, even if you just take the ends of your celery, put in a little glass of water, wait till it sprouts. You can always keep a perpetual celery going on the windowsill and grow your own. The food stocks that we see come into our supermarkets are often 7 to 10 days old by the time they get here. So the vitamin and nutritional content has already been on a decline for many days. So I think it's really worrisome. People are not as well nourished as they used to be, and I think they're consuming more and more calories trying to get themselves nourished. And I think that that's a real problem with potentially problems with obesity. So, I mean, I think it's such a complex system. There's so much that could be done, but I'm so glad the Sierra Club's involved in helping us figure it out and make it happen.
Well, thank you. And I think we're going to be sticking with it. As we've said, everybody eats. And,
Yes. Yes. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Appreciate the time.
It fits with the segue we're going to make into our next segment where Todd's going to come to the fore and he's going to tell us a little bit more about the testimony that he gave. I was down there capturing that at the Capitol last week when he was in front of Representative Tom McMillan's subcommittee. Well, it's not a subcommittee, it's Committee on Oversight.
Yeah.
And they're looking at the issues of the sunshine laws. It was Sunshine Week nationally, Freedom of Information Act, Open Meetings Act. And Todd has always had an exciting series of events occur whenever he tries to get information out of government agencies or go to various meetings.
Well, I do rely heavily on the Freedom of Information Act and
We
the
know
Open
more.
Meetings Act.
There are
Here
agencies
comes
across the
Todd.
state. Yes, there he is again.
Although, interestingly, I think some people tend to underestimate me. I think they tend to go, oh, there's that Todd Haywood. And then they do something against the law. And I go, that's against the law.
I know.
And they say, well, so what? And I say, oh, really? And then suddenly you have this big, giant storm of fecal matter.
Yes, it
So-
does hit certain fans.
It
at
does.
certain times.
It does.
You displayed, and you could go to Lansing Online News and see the exhibit that we put in on the webpage that relates to Todd's testimony in front of that committee. When Todd was exploring situation which sort of, in light of Steubenville, the Steubenville rape case, there were allegations that two MSU basketball players had sexually assaulted a young woman. And he has this vivid example of how the Freedom of Information Act, which is supposed to give you documents with only a few things that they can legally redact, he has two versions of the same police report. And one looks like, all you can, as the chairman said, all you can see is a and the.
Yeah.
And the other one in which the only thing redacted are the names. And now two different agencies gave you two totally different
Same document.
Same document. But that's not supposed to happen, Todd.
Well, no, it's not supposed to happen, but I think that that's where we get into two different and really important distinctions that are happening here. One is we have institutions that are hiring attorneys whose whole job is to figure out ways to avoid releasing information to the public.
Okay.
Michigan State University has been one of the biggest abusers of that. And we see a continuing body of exemptions
Yes.
being read instead of may exempt, which means that you have to use some discretion. And in using that discretion, you're supposed to weigh that based on the introduction of the Freedom of Information Act, which says all citizens, except for those who are locked up, should have access to full and complete information about the operations of government and the public employees.
Right.
But
Which
instead
is a
of
wonderful thing. It came into existence after Watergate, when people
2 years
realized
after.
that there was a need to have a law on the books, a federal law followed by state laws, that would make it easier for people to get information on this. We pay for it with our tax dollars, therefore we have a right to it.
correct, and unfortunately, instead of that may exempt, where you're weighing very carefully constructed exemptions, it's become a must exempt. So, for instance, as I testified last week, I have a police report from the Grand Rapids Police Department where they redacted the names of uniformed officers that responded to a domestic situation at a place in a case that I was investigating. Now, I hardly believe that those officers were undercover officers or confidential informants, which are the only reasons to exempt somebody, by the way, from law enforcement. And yet, the detectives are crossed out, the uniform officers are crossed out. The detective testified on the stand. It's not like it's a secret who he was. And yet, this is what we deal with on a regular basis, is these just absolutely untrained individuals who are taking it upon themselves to willy-nilly release and not release information.
So why do you think the public lets that happen? I mean, what's gone wrong with this law? Because it's endemic, what you're describing.
It is endemic, and I think what it comes down to is that you have a public that is less engaged, and they believe they're more engaged, but I think they're less engaged, and as a result, they don't realize how much information is being withheld from them. I mean, I talked to Kathy Hoekstra over at the Detroit News about the investigation that I did on Michigan's HIV event system. That was the longest investigation that I've ever done, not because it was more complicated than anything I've ever done before, but because the systems have been set up to drag the investigation on in hopes that it won't go to press. And I think that that's become a tactic for governments as well, to delay, deny, and obstruct access to information.
Todd, I was telling Bonnie when we were talking about having you on our show, when this law was first put into place, I was the FOI, Opens Meeting Coordinator for the Department of Labor, and we were exactly the opposite of what you're describing.
Right.
Everything was open to the point of it was like, oh no. I remember letting the Free Press have access to every piece of information on what's Michigan's worker law for industrial accidents, and we knew we were going to get whipped.
OSHA?
Yeah, it was
MyOSHA.
MyOSHA. I mean,
Yeah.
they had everything, and they must have run 3 pages for 8 days straight. That just ripped us,
Mm-hmm.
and we knew it going in. I mean, because we knew what was there,
Sure.
and they were right. But today, you wouldn't get anywhere near that.
No,
Or if you did, they couldn't have afforded it.
and that's
Yeah,
exactly,
Free Press.
there's economic stonewalling that they do, and they do it on purpose. And
Yeah.
that was part of the conversation about the MSU versus Ingham County FOIAs. The Ingham County prosecutor gave me that police report from MSU at no cost. MSU wanted almost $900. Same report, same number of pages.
But it took more ink on there, see?
That's
Because it had the
right.
black ink.
It was the expense for that attorney to cross everything out.
And that's exactly what it was. It was the I think it was $125 an hour we were paying the attorney to sit there sorting the exempt from non-exempt material.
This is LCC Radio, WLNZ, 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We're talking with reporter Todd Haywood about the consequences of the difficulties of exercising your rights as a citizen under the Freedom of Information Act. One of the things that people may not realize is private citizens have the same right as journalists do under this
Absolutely.
law. The whole idea was that engaged citizens should be able to get their hands on this, and in an era of citizen journalism, I was thinking the other day, I think it's time to put together a little Kickstarter, get a kitty of money going, and start FOIAing all the things we want to know about.
Well, I think it would be really interesting to do a FOIA and Open Meetings Act audit for all of the local governments in the
Yeah,
area.
give them a grade, A, B, C, D,
And let's
E.
let's do that. And I think I think a lot of local municipalities are going to be really angry if we do that because they're not going to pass
Yeah.
or they're going to just barely scrape by because we have moved so far away from the process. And I want to step back a little bit too. I think it's really important when we talk about this that we recognize there is some data that is owned by the state. that
There
we
are
don't-
exemptions,
that
yes.
we well
There are
not just exemptions, but that there are valid reasons for that. For instance, every person that's tested positive for HIV, we have all of their information, all of their testing data in a state-owned database. People should not have access to that information, right? But where we run into the sort of a natural tension, and I ran into this last week, was with the Open Meetings Act
Mhm.
and the Michigan HIV/AIDS Council, which is a public body under the Michigan Open Meetings Act. And I went, and they handed me a document that was a confidentiality agreement, which is illegal. You can't require somebody to do anything to attend a meeting of a public body. And when I said, I'm sorry, this violates the Open Meetings Act, I won't sign it, they said, well, our bylaws say you have to sign it if you're going to attend the meeting. I left the meeting and dealt with the process to deal with the violation of the Open Meetings Act. But the state is saying, oh, we didn't ask you to leave.
Right.
So and what it turns out is that the woman who was running the meeting had no training or understanding about the Open Meetings Act. And I think that that's an ongoing problem in the state. When I tell younger journalists, here are these great tools. When I tell citizen activists, here are these great tools, they look at me like I'm nuts.
Well, I was part of a government project where they brought in an attorney to teach us about FOIA. You might have not have been any happier, Tom. The spirit did not seem to be, let's see all the ways in which we can inform people. The spirit was, here's a list of things that you can not, that you can use to not give them given.
And I've been through some of those trainings. I've sat through them privately, and I use those to my advantage as I'm crafting my FOIAs,
Very good.
which is part of the reason why I irritate public bodies whenever I file a FOIA or follow up with an appeal, is because I can cite the case law. They don't like that from somebody who's not an attorney. They really don't like
Let me
that.
tell you what I've noted in my career as the trajectory of this law over time, and we've got you and Bill here to kind of give both sides of this. Back in the old days, and Bill and I were talking about this when he was doing work trying to find out about the coal ash from Board of Water and Light. In the old days, what you had where you had beat reporters who had developed, cultivated in a community relationships where you could go down to the local prosecuting attorney's office, or, I was just talking to an old police chief friend of mine, they'd have the reporters sit in on the morning meetings,
Yeah.
at the police department, that kind of thing. And you had these relationships where the government was fairly quick to share some information. Watergate proved to us that you could get too cozy, and there were times that you weren't getting the information that was maybe not being given to you. You were getting only some of the reports or certain reports. So at first, when the law came in, it seemed that the agencies were terrified by it, and they were afraid of being called up and ridiculed
Absolutely.
for it. And so they were very quick to comply, just as you talked about, Bill. But over the years, they've begun to realize two things. First of all, nothing much happens if they drag their feet. Because then the people on the other side are forced with spending a lot of money for attorneys in order to sue. That's the only way that they can get them to move. And the reality is, I don't think the public understands how much that has changed and how difficult it is for reporters to get their hands on things nowadays.
Yeah, I think you're right. And actually, sort of to exemplify the having to sue scenario, there was just a case that was decided by the appeals court last week. I guess it was 2 weeks ago now, where a woman requested a copy of video of getting a ticket from a Michigan State trooper, and the state police said, "Oh, we don't have that video." She went to court, and the prosecutor produced the video in court to prosecute her. So she sued because they clearly
Lied.
illegally denied
Suppressed
the
it,
access. And she was awarded reasonable attorney fees. And what the trial court decided, the folks at the appeals court reduced it.
Reduced it. Oh.
And of course, there's
What
only
amounts are we talking? Do you remember?
it was a couple of $100,000. It wasn't. I mean, it wasn't huge amounts of money, but it was. I mean, it was a good chunk. And frankly, having dealt with these cases, I can see how an attorney could put in $100,000, $200,000 worth of time
Mm-hmm.
into chasing one of these cases. And the $500 punitive fine is nothing, and that's what's statutorily required. Now, what's interesting is that I could have litigated the case with Michigan State University, and each word that they redacted capriciously,
Mm-hmm.
they could have been hit with a $500 fine for each
For
one.
each word.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And so when you start getting into redaction cases,
Wow.
you scare the hell out of the public body when you say, well, we'll just let a judge decide whether or not that was a redactable word.
Has
But
the
there's not
statute
that-
of limitations gone after?
It has.
Ah.
It has.
There's a very small cadre of people that first will sue and then have the money to sue,
Right.
Yeah.
and that they know that going in.
Well, and I'll be honest with you, the Open Meetings Act lawsuits that I've filed, the FOIA lawsuits that I've filed, I've written them myself. And
Right.
I'm not a trained lawyer. I'm pretty good at what I'm doing, and I've been told by the attorneys that have gone up against me that they don't want to go up against me again. But not everybody has that ability, that skill.
Right.
And I know, talking to my colleagues in the media, and Bonnie, you know this, they don't have the money. It's just not there. There's no institutional support to pursue this on a legal case. I mean, I think the Kwame Kilpatrick story is really the last time that we had a real serious fight in court over FOIA and
Right.
FOIA-able documents. And even that,
It wasn't really FOIA, though, was it? I mean, it was those text messages were given to the reporters. The question was whether they had the right to print them.
that was
But that's a different.
there was
issue.
that, but they also obtained some stuff through FOIA that was argued, and that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and was decided in favor of the free press. But the public information aspect here, something that people don't understand. I mean, we try every time we use FOIA, we try very hard to say we got these documents from a Freedom of Information Act request, but maybe we need to be more in your face about it to say.
I was just going to suggest, I made a little note while you were talking. I think every article that relies on those documents should have a sidebar that lists the history of what you had to go through to get the information. Because I don't think readers understand. They don't know the delays, they don't know the amount of money involved, they don't know the frustration that in the old days you could just go up to the county clerk and say, hand me this. And one of the things that came out at the hearing the other day was there are databases out there that would be very valuable. Put it on a CD-ROM and hand it to someone. They don't have to do that. They don't have to, quote unquote,
Yep.
summarize the material. Well, a database could contain thousands of pages of information you don't need to get that one nugget you do, and the cost then becomes prohibitive, so you never get your hands on it. And I think that's really sad, because I think government is clamping down so much on access to information recently. It's just the PRization of the whole government process is really worrisome.
And I think it was interesting. I was actually on a conference call this afternoon where I brought up Michigan's, under Governor Snyder, you can't talk to anybody but the public information officer in any department.
That came out of that hearing
Yeah.
from a number of people,
Yeah.
didn't it?
Yeah, and what's interesting is that in this conference call with public health people from around the country, it was off the record, just so that in case any of their bosses are listening, they can't talk to the media without the PIO being there. In fact, several of these very top-ranking health officials from around the country were prohibited from even doing an off-the-record conference call with a reporter.
That's worrisome. How do we get the information? And what has to change for this to get better, John?
Well, I think it's unfortunately, I think it's going to take something similar to another Watergate scandal. I mean, I really do, and I think, frankly, there was just a ruling in the ACLU lawsuit about getting CIA documents related to drone strikes, where the federal judge said,
yeah, you can't do this anymore.
you can't do this anymore. Release the documents. You're making just bad arguments. This is just stop. I hope that the drone battle is going to be our next Watergate, but I'm not sure. I mean, people get really wound up about somebody's going to take my guns, or somebody's got a list of everybody who's got a gun permit in my neighborhood. Why aren't they wound up about the fact that their names are ending up in secret databases in the health department, or the no-fly lists for the Department of Homeland Security.
Oh God, I
or,
feel sorry for people caught up in that nightmare.
I mean,
Oh.
there's all kinds of data collection being captured all over this country that we don't know about, and that's the Freedom of Information Act, the Open Meetings Act, our transparency laws have not kept pace
No, they have not.
with the technology either. So even if I were able to get, say, that database that we were talking about, I think it was something in the state police that ACLU was looking at, I would still have to pay an enormous amount of money because the state hasn't figured out, oh, really, all it is click and copy the whole database onto a CD.
Yeah.
I mean,
Should take 5 minutes.
I have on multiple occasions requested, like, now that Word documents have track changes on them.
Yes.
I've requested the documents be released in Word, so they don't even have to go through the process of saving them as a PDF.
Oh.
And they won't even do that now.
Because they're afraid of the changes.
Because they know that the track changes are going to get looked
Ah.
at. I've asked that the documents, like during this HIV event system thing, they refused to send me documents in an electronic format. So I kept going down to the health department. I've got literally a stack of documents about 8 inches thick just on this one investigation. We could have saved how many trees by just simply putting those on CD,
yeah,
or emailing them to me. And that again comes down to, it's not required under the Act, so they're going to do everything they can to make it as uncomfortable and as costly as possible to gain access to the documents.
Relentlessly partisan that I typically am, I would like to blame all of this on the Republicans, but I think it's infected both parties
You
equally
can't.
now. It
You
started.
can't.
No,
It may have started long
Granholm
ago,
administration wasn't any different.
but no, and that's what's so unfortunate. I mean, it's so hard nowadays to get any information at a time when there are fewer and fewer people on staff in various places who are seeking it. So we're already restricting the flow of access simply by the fact we don't have as many people to assign to the task. I really do hope citizens begin to exercise this opportunity more on their own. But I think they're very nervous about the thought that, well, what if I get a bill and it's $900? I can't pay that.
Well, and there are ways to challenge that. And please give me a call. Help me figure it out. Actually, email me. And I do that. I have found myself that I have become sort of an secret source for a lot of journalists around
the FOIA
states. The FOIA coach. I've helped a lot of people write FOIAs and FOIA appeals to get documents that we know are there, but the government is denying.
It's really a sad situation when you have to fight your government for information.
It really is, particularly when we have a law that says all citizens should have access to full and complete information about the operations of the government and their public officials.
This was the anniversary of the law too, wasn't it? What year did it go into effect?
Went into effect in 1976.
Okay. Dave Hollister.
Dave Hollister did indeed pass that through.
Mm-hmm.
Dave Hollister, the same guy who, by the way, didn't release the financial health report for the city, but went around chattering about what he found. Well, Mr. Hollister, in the name of transparency, which you claim to be father of, could you please share the document so that we can make our own determination?
It's up there now on the state.
Well, yeah, it's up there now.
Yeah.
But there was a whole weekend to spin before we got access to the data.
As I made clear on Facebook, and got challenged by the city, suggesting that, well, they were actually being more transparent by giving us a look first. Well, I don't want my information pre-digested.
It's pretty illogical. If you can't have the information in your hand.
Yeah, it's exciting in these FOIA trenches, isn't it, Todd?
It is indeed.
We'll have you back repeatedly, I think, on this topic and many others related to it. Thank you very much for listening to LCC Radio, WLNZ, here in Lansing, Michigan. This has been Lansing Online News Radio with Bonnie and Bill. Take a look at our website and come back next Monday night and join us again. Thank you very much. Click. And I don't know why the little guy, thank goodness he finally broadcast and recorded.